Mr. William Leahy, present your argument, please.
Your Honours, Counsel for the Defence, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I come to praise Shakespeare, not to bury him. Let me begin by telling you what I am not going to argue in this case today. I'm not arguing that Shakespeare's plays are not wonderfully dramatic and important pieces of great literature. I'm not arguing that they are not funny, tragic, informative and complex. I'm not arguing that they should not be studied at university. What I am arguing is that despite the received wisdom that they are relevant to today's society and can teach us about ourselves now, they are not relevant, and they can teach us nothing that modern literature cannot teach us about contemporary lives in the modern world. Following on from this, I'm arguing that they should not be studied in schools, but should give way to more relevant and contemporary literature, and should form part of the study of literature at universities in the context of literary history, much as, say, Chaucer is. I say all of this because, in my view, we as a society and as a culture have been convinced and persuaded that the study of Shakespeare is essential to our view of ourselves as civilized, as educated, indeed as human. Furthermore, it's essential to our understanding of our English identity. But this is a simplistic myth. And as such, it sits alongside the simplistic myths that we have been convinced about regarding such things as Brexit, Trump, and regarding the actual present itself. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, let me take you back to the 1920s. We're just a few years after the end of the First World War, and Europe is in turmoil. As well as the perceived failures of the ruling classes in all countries, actual Marxist revolution has occurred in Russia and threatens all European ruling elites. Germany looks as if it will be the next to fall. And in England, there is enormous anxiety on the part of the ruling classes that we too will see such a revolution. And they were right to be anxious. Much conflict did occur. And indeed, of course, in 1926 in this country, we saw the Great Strike. One response to the war and its aftermath was the perceived need in England to have a national education system that would educate the uneducated, that would upskill the unskilled, that would civilize the working classes. More than anything else, the urge was to placate through education, to nullify the revolutionary tendencies that arose because of the utter poverty and inequality that defined the lives of the poor, particularly given what the ruling classes had made the poor soldiers go through in World War I. The urge to unify all classes through education, to encourage a sense of unified national identity, a sense of Englishness shared by all irrespective of class, and which would be the common factor around which all English people could gather. Thus, in 1921, Sir Henry Newbolt produced his report that was commissioned by the Board of Education, entitled The Teaching of English in England. This report established the foundations of modern English teaching and of modern English studies. It professionalised the forms of teaching of English literature. It established a canon and argued that English must become the linguistic and literary standard throughout the British Empire. At the pinnacle of the canon, of course, was Shakespeare. Why Shakespeare? Well, of course, the study of English literature had already begun to replace the study of the classics in our universities. Shakespeare was central to this as, since the time of the Romantics, he had come to be viewed as the great artist of nature, as opposed to artifice, like Ben Jonson, which the Romantics valued, and an important aspect of this was the fact that in Shakespeare's plays, all classes are represented. Commoners mixed with kings, barkeepers mixed with aristocrats, whores mixed with lords. Oh, that bit's quite relevant, I suppose. His substantial body of work, which contains so very much about England, was naturally very attractive as a core element of this new English curriculum. Thus, the study of Shakespeare's texts became central to the study of English from 1921, the main driver being to instill in the population a sense of English identity and shared values, a sense of togetherness across all classes that religion no longer achieved, in order to prevent the danger of rebellion and revolution, in order that the poor did not seek to prioritize their needs over their sense of belonging to this sceptred isle, this blessed plot, this earth, this realm, this England. So that was in 1921. Let's fast forward 97 years to today. Shakespeare occupies exactly the same position at the pinnacle of the English canon and is taught often from primary school onwards. We all know our kids struggle with Shakespeare, but we do not argue. No, we accept it with a, it must be good for you. We accept it often when our kids plead with us, please make it go away. With phrases such as, yes, but, well, of course it's difficult. It's Shakespeare. As though that explains everything. But it explains nothing. And it is difficult, isn't it? Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, allow me to present to you Exhibit 1, a scene from As You Like It, with Celia, Rosalind, and Touchstone.
Nay, now thou goest from Fortune's office to Nature's. Fortune reigns in gifts of the world, not in the lineaments of nature.
No. When nature hath made a fair creature, may she not by fortune fall into the fire? Though nature hath given us wit to flout at fortune, hath not fortune sent in this fool to cut off the argument?
Indeed, there is fortune too hard for nature, when of nature's wit.
Peradventure this is not fortune's work neither, but nature's, who perceiveth our natural wits too dull to reason of such goddesses, and has sent this natural for our whetstone, for always the dullness of the fool is the whetstone of the wits. How now, wit, whither wander you?
Mistress, you must come away to your father.
Were you made the messenger?
No, by mine honour, but I was bid to come for you.
Where learned you that oath, fool?
Oh, by a certain knight that sworn by his honour they were good for pancakes, and swore by his honour that mustard was naught. Now I stand to it. The pancakes was naught, and the mustard was good, and yet was not the naught forsworn.
Well, how prove you that in the great heap of your knowledge?
Aye, marry, now unmuzzle your wisdom.
Stand you both forth now. Stroke your chins, and swear by your beard that I am knave.
By our beards, if we had 'em, thou art.
By my knavery, if I had it, then I were. But if you swear by that, that is not, you are not forsworn, no more than this knight swearing by his honour, for he never had any. Or if he had sworn it away, never before, if he saw those pancakes or those mustards.
Thank you. What in God's name was that all about?
I
Any
know.
idea?
Yeah.
No? Shut up. Okay? No idea whatsoever what that's all about. Okay? Now, remember, this is a popular text in the curriculum on schools. But let's not forget, this case that I'm making is about relevance, not about difficulty. So, why study Shakespeare at school? I have no idea. He may well in some way capture Englishness, as we are told, but let's just bottom that out a bit, shall we? Is that true? So, in Taming of the Shrew, he glorifies and justifies domestic abuse. Indeed, the abused woman must submit and apologise to the abuser for our happy ending. In Romeo and Juliet, we witness the operation of a paedophile. I'm sorry, but Juliet is 13 years old. With Aaron in Titus Andronicus and the Prince of Morocco in The Merchant of Venice, we witness blatant and unrepentant racism. And speaking of The Merchant of Venice, in which we see the harassment and humiliation of a Jewish man, did we all know that it's a comedy? Are these the values we wish to teach our children now? And when it comes to England, why are we teaching our children about the behaviours of kings, for God's sake, as though that's in some way representative of life? How is that relevant other than as history? Furthermore, I would say the whole project regarding the unifying of English identity is a misconceived one. Anyway, in the plays as a whole, and particularly in the English history plays, the lower classes appear in order to be ridiculed, humiliated, or punished. Are these English characteristics at play? Or rather, the fantasies of the English ruling classes? And even in those plays, and there are many, where we witness some positive values, such as many powerful female characters, the mixing of the classes, the triumphs of virtue, why do we make our kids struggle through the antiquated language and not just let them witness those values in contemporary literature? If it is the values we value, why deflect from them by drowning our kids in opaque and ancient language? Now, let me present Exhibit 2, a scene with touchstone again. After some cynical whimsy in the nature of honesty and beauty and other stuff that's quite difficult to understand, Touchstone launches into a passage about entering into marriage. Exhibit 2.
A man may, if he were a fearful heart, stagger in this attempt, for here we have no temple but the wood, no assembly but horn beasts. But what though? Courage. As horns are odious, they are necessary. It is said, many a man knows no end of his goods. Right. Many a man has good horns, and knows no end of them. Well, that is the dowry of his wife. 'Tis none of his own getting. Horns? Even so. Poor men alone? No. The noblest deer hath them as huge as the rascal. Is the single man therefore blessed? No. As a walled town is more worthier than a village, so is the forehead of a married man more honourable than the bare brow of a bachelor. And by how much defence is better than no skill? By so much is a horn more precious than to want.
Huh? So what is the defence? Why still study Shakespeare? I'm sure you'll hear from my honoured colleague opposite that Shakespeare teaches us about love, about hate, about power, about ambition, about what it is to be human. My response to this is simple. What does that mean? If we want to know about power, let's study the poetry of Benjamin Zephaniah. If we want to know about love, then study the novel Mr. Loverman by Bernardine Evaristo. If we want to know about contemporary Englishness, then study the poetry of Dowjat Nagra. If we want to understand what it is to be human now, then study Will Self. All four here at Brunel. The point I'm making is this. Literature is about all of these things, not just Shakespeare. Literature is about human experience in all its heterogeneity, not just Shakespeare. Literature can teach us all of these things, not just Shakespeare. And all of these authors just named, and there are thousands more, are a damn sight easier to understand for our kids than Shakespeare, and a damn sight more relevant to their lives. The problem with Shakespeare is this. He can teach us nothing about now because the works are so old. They can teach us a lot about England at that time, and indeed about English people and society at that time, but not about now. Shakespeare's works are so old that we can only approach them through universal themes, such as love, for example. We cannot approach them through specifics, such as love now. We can learn nothing from Romeo and Juliet about love now. To learn about love now, we need to read and study about love now. Why read about love then, other than as a historical study? Only in a historical sense of literary history is Shakespeare relevant. Tell me if I'm wrong. We do not make our kids at school learn geography from 400 years ago, or maths from 400 years ago, or French from 400 years ago. So why do we make them study drama from 400 years ago? So, to my point, learning Shakespeare at school is inherently nostalgic. It is all about nostalgia. Learning Shakespeare at school looks backward to the past. It is not about the future, it's not even about the present. And the modernized versions of Shakespeare we see are all part of this. Seeing Julius Caesar in a bomber jacket and with a Make America Great Again cap on, or Henry V set in the Iraq War, or Richard III set in a corporate environment, they're all interesting, but they do not make the plays relevant other than in the most generalized terms. And so, to Brexit and Trump and the complexity of the now, our politicians have lost the ability to explain and govern the now. The world has become too complex for us and them to understand, and so no narrative can grasp this reality, and thus we are supplied with and convinced and persuaded by simplistic, nostalgic narratives that claim to explain the world, make America great again, take back control, and so on. These narratives bear no analysis, but they comfort us in their simplicity and their nostalgia. We struggle to understand the complex world, and these simplistic narratives, these myths, comfort us in their very simplicity and appear to explain the world we have lost. The world we have lost. Our belief in the relevance of Shakespeare is one of these simplistic narratives. But this bears no analysis. The language is outmoded, the themes are outmoded, the values are outmoded. The study of Shakespeare no longer unifies us, if it ever did, and it is time to give our kids a break and let them study what is relevant and meaningful to them. We live in a fragmented society, in a fragmented world. It is complex and almost impossible to grasp. The literature our kids study at school should reflect this reality. It should not pretend to be something it's not. And we should not allow our kids to be guided in their lives by simplistic myths. That is a form of indoctrination. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I trust you will agree that the case I've made is compelling and irrefutable. But let me finish with the wisdom of Shakespeare. This from King Henry IV, Part 1. As the honey of Hybla, my old lad of the castle, and is not a buff jerkin in a most sweet robe of durance?
Is that the end?
Mr. Betteridge, your submissions, please.
Your Honours, learned friend, jury, my client totally accepts there were mistakes. Okay? He's not denying that. Winter's Tale is 2 plays. He just got bored. That's a fair comment. He doesn't actually know what to be or not to be means. It just sounded like a good idea at the time.
Objection, Your Honour.
Thank you. So my
Honour,
client does
you haven't heard
accept.
my objection. Okay, he is claiming to be inside the mind of Shakespeare, who's been dead for years. How can he know? How can he know? You need to stick.
He's
Surely, Your
building
Honour,
up his argument to the relevance of Shakespeare. Overruled.
Thank you. Thank you, Your Honour, for protecting me from this very aggressive behaviour. So,
objection, Your Honour. It was a mere interjection. It wasn't aggressive.
Mr. Leahy, if you carry on, I will hold you in contempt.
So my client accepts that he made mistakes, okay? But he would argue that he cannot be held responsible for the way other people have used his work. He cannot be held responsible for the way in which his work has functioned within the education system of this country. What my client would argue, I am sure, if I could get into his mind, is that there are aspects of his plays which do still teach us things, which are still relevant, which are about crucial issues. Now, my learned friend is right. In many ways, the only way to defend Shakespeare is to start using a language which in some ways our culture has renounced, forgotten. Because you can only defend Shakespeare if you start thinking about universal ideas. If you start thinking about what it means to be human. Okay? And one of the things which is interesting, one of the things I would ask the jury to reflect upon is why we as a culture, and I'm using this in a very broad sense, have stopped thinking in those terms. Why have we done that? It's a strange thing to do. My client asked me to use a quote from another great writer, William Faulkner, American writer. Strangely, Shakespeare, you've got to imagine yourself like that film in Hollywood when they go up to heaven and there's a case. So Shakespeare's met Faulkner in heaven. So I hadn't really thought this through, this idea. Faulkner says, "The past is never dead. It is not even past." One of the things to remember when we're thinking about Shakespeare, when we think about all language is historical. There is no language that isn't historical. Will Stealth's work is historical. So when we think about Shakespeare, we're thinking about language which is like all language. And he has really important lessons to teach us in terms of politics, in terms of love, and in terms of death. The 3 most basic things about what it means to be a human. So think about politics. I'm going to read you a very short bit from the opening of Othello. This is Iago speaking. So Iago is talking to Desdemona's father, shouting up to the window. And he's telling him that Othello and Desdemona are together. But he doesn't directly tell him. He says, "Even now, very now, an old black ram is tupping your white ewe." Okay? Now what Iago's doing there is he's obviously using a racist image. It's a carnivalesque image. It's an image from popular culture. He's turning Othello into a black ram. He's turning Desdemona into a white ewe. He's creating that image. Okay? And he's inviting us to imagine it. He's not being explicit. He's asking us to engage in our imagination, to visualize this. Okay? That's what Iago does, because that's his behaviour. He's a salesman. And in particular, it's what Iago does, because he doesn't care about the truth of what he's saying. All that matters to him is the effect. Who can remember what Donald Trump's picture of his wall looked like? Can anyone remember that? None of you can, because he never produced one. Very deliberate, because Donald Trump's like Iago. He never produced a picture of his wall because he wanted his voters, and indeed the people who opposed him, to imagine it, to do that work. If he'd produced an image, people would have been able to say, oh, that never worked, or that's not how I imagined it, or I thought it should be like this. But like Iago, with that racist image, what Donald Trump did was create an ideal, or an idea of the wall, and he allowed his voters to imagine what they wanted it to be. Now, of course, my learned friend could say there are all sorts of ways of understanding the way in which political language works. There are all sorts of ways of drilling down into how people make people understand them, how ideology works. But what Shakespeare does, and what he would argue, is that his plays are particularly powerful in terms of teaching us these lessons, making us experience these lessons because they are dramas, because they are designed to be performed. If you think about something like Romeo and Juliet, I mean, my learned friend is absolutely right. There are issues with Romeo and Juliet. Juliet is very young, Romeo is very young. But this is a play which has become central to ways in which we understand love. One of the things to think about is how we understand love, how we understand death. These are not abstract things. These are things we learn how to understand through and in language. So when you have a play like Romeo and Juliet, which expresses an ideal, a fantasy of love, that becomes about part of how we understand this idea. Juliet, throughout this play, is teaching Romeo about love. That's one of the things that this play does. So I'm now going to show you Exhibit 1. This is Exhibit 1. It's Romeo and Juliet. It's when they first meet. Okay? So if I could ask my actors to...
If I profane with my unworthiest hand this holy shrine, the gentle fine is this. My lips, two blushing pilgrims, ready stand to smooth that rough touch with a tender kiss.
Good pilgrim, you do wrong your hand too much, which mannerly devotion shows in this. For saints have hands that pilgrims' hands do touch, and palm to palm is holy palmer's kiss.
Have not saints lips, and holy palmers too?
Aye, pilgrim, lips that they must use in prayer.
Oh, then, dear saint, let lips do what hands do. They pray, grant thou, lest faith turns to despair.
Saints do not move, though grant for prayer's sake.
And move not while my prayer's effect I take. Thus for my lips by thine my sin is purged.
Then have my lips the sin that they have took.
Sin for my lips? Oh, trespass sweetly urged. Give me my sin again.
You kiss by the book.
Objection, Your Honour. She's 13.
One of the problems that my learned colleague has is grasp the fact this is a fiction. So this is someone playing at being 13. Okay. Anyway.
Objection, Your Honour. No, that makes it okay.
I'm not saying it's okay. Okay. I'm saying that this play is about love. It's about that fantasy of love. Okay. It's a play in which Shakespeare is making us think about love. You're right. They are very young. Part of the reason they're very young is because what he wants to do in this play is stage a lesson about love. How did that section end? You kiss by the book. Did anyone notice what that dialogue was? I can't really see you, so I'm going to assume that no one's put their hand up. Okay? All right? That's a sonnet. What they just did, and if you go back and look at it in the play, they've just spoken a sonnet. So when Juliet says to Romeo, you kiss by the book, what she's saying to him is, you're just kind of reproducing language learnt from elsewhere. Because one of the things that my learned friend has said is that Shakespeare's very complex. Shakespeare's very dated. Yes, that's absolutely right. Shakespeare knows that. That's one of the things he's talking about in his plays. Juliet has to teach Romeo how to express his love in ways which are not by the book, in ways which are not abstract, which are not historical, ways which are about who he is. Because she says, he keeps saying, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, and she says, no, don't. And at one stage he says to her, what is your love? How you express? And she says, my bounty is as boundless as the sea. My love is deep. The more I give to thee, the more I have, for both are infinite. That's not complex. That's a statement of an ideal image of love, a love which is endless, infinite. That's what she's trying to teach Romeo. She's trying to teach Romeo, and Bill, I'd recommend you look at it again because there's a lesson there for you.
Objection, Your Honour. That was patronising.
Yeah.
Sustained. Thank you. Sustained.
She's teaching, and Shakespeare is aware of this. He's aware that what he's doing in his play is staging the confrontation between different languages of love. The language of love which is drenched in power, in the present, in society, a language which is deeply misogynist and sexist, and the language of love which emerges between Romeo and Juliet. And the real tragedy of Romeo and Juliet is what happens at the very end. So at the very end they die. That's not the tragedy. The real tragedy is what their fathers do. Their fathers say, oh, this is all awful, we're going to make up, we're going to build a statue to represent their love. What would that look like? What would a statue of a love which is infinite look like? That's a moment when society, culture, history, all the things that Bill has quite rightly criticised, come crashing back in. The very end of Romeo and Juliet, the prince says, who's the ruler, a glooming peace this morning with it brings. The sun, for sorrow, will not show his head. Go hence to have more talk of these sad things. Some shall be pardoned and some punished. For never was a Shakespeare pushing at the boundaries of language and what language can and can't do. Okay? I'm now going to give you Exhibit 2. Okay, now this is from, I'm going to, yes, do come up by all means. This is from the opening of King Lear. King Lear. So there was a Shakespeare joke which love has been made into a commodity to be exchanged. Fortunately, we don't have anything like that in our society. That has nothing to teach us. I'd like to do just, now this next bit follows immediately on from the scene we've just seen, so if we could just have our final exhibit, please.
Now, our joy, although the last, not the least, to whose young love the vines of France and milk of Burgundy strive to be interest. And what can you say to draw a third more opulent than your sisters? Speak.
Nothing, my lord.
Nothing?
Nothing.
Nothing can come of nothing. Speak again.
Unhappy as I am, I cannot heave my heart into my mouth. I love your majesty according to my bond, no more nor less.
In that section, nothing is repeated 5 times. There's nothing complex about that. That's about a great poet using the possibilities of language, drawing on the possibilities of language, creating a tension between this obscene competition, a competition that Shakespeare makes clear is entirely corrupt. Lear says, what can you say to draw a third more opulent than your daughters? In other words, a third which is more than a third. So not only is this an obscene love competition, it's one that Lear is not actually running fairly. Cordelia says nothing. I love you according to my bond. Greek theatre talks about cathartic moments, catharsis. And we tend to think that's all about tragedy, but it's not. What Aristotle meant when he talked about catharsis was the way in which theatre is like a laboratory, a testing ground, a school for talking about how we learn about what it means to be human, how we learn emotions, how we learn about the self. You know, Bill's argument is really strong, but it'd be even stronger if we were talking about Antigone now. Antigone, the first real play written in Europe. It's 2,500 years old. It's a play about love, politics, and death. It's a play in which a strong woman says, when she's confronted with the choice between staying true to herself or compromising, she says, I am who I am. It's a play in which Sophocles is talking to the polis of Athens about the choices around love, death, and politics. That's what Shakespeare constantly does. King Lear is one of those plays, and this means nothing because I'm a complete softie, that I almost always end up crying at when I go and see. I also have that problem with Romeo and Juliet, because it's so sad. So at the end of the play, I'm sorry, spoiler alert, at the end of the day, Lear comes on stage and he's carrying Cordelia's body. And there's this terribly powerful moment. And what Lear says is, never, 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 never. He just repeats those words. Shakespeare, this incredible manipulator of language, reducing it down to the most basic. Because in the face of death, that's where he takes us as a poet. That's why he is still relevant. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Honour, Counsel for the Defence. Ladies and gentlemen, the jury. I will just say a few things about some of the things that Tom said. Okay, now, information you should know, I brought Tom to this university.
Right, okay, objection, definite objection.
Okay, when Tom came to this university, and I had a significant input to that, I assumed he was intelligent. And in all sorts of ways, he's proved himself to be thus. However, the analysis of Shakespeare's plays, I find, if I may say, as good as it was, there's a lot of the usual old guff. And let's just take a few examples. So, the statement, all language is historical. Yes, all language is historical. Some language is more historical than others. And that's precisely my point. There are some languages that become so historical that they are impenetrable for young people. And one thing Tom didn't address, if I may say, is the question about whether this Shakespeare is relevant for kids at school. Okay, he assumes that it's relevant for all, and that's part of the problem. But another couple of examples. Your discussion about politics and Othello using the imagery of black ram, white ewe. And then this 5-minute discussion around what Shakespeare is doing there. Shakespeare is doing there a pretty unsubtle piece of imagery that we don't really have to work very hard with our imaginations to create a picture of, nor do we have to work very hard to create a picture of Trump's wall. You picture a big wall. Now, what I would say about this use of imagery is, yeah, it's fine, it's okay, but you discover it in a million. That's what literature is. It's using language in this kind of way to create imagery. This is no amazing piece of imagery, if I may say. And indeed, all drama does this. Let's speak a little bit about Romeo and Juliet, okay, about love. How many plays talk about love? I mean, most of them, even the ones that don't talk about love, are talking about love in one way or another. And your statement that Romeo and Juliet is about love, it's not about love. Romeo and Juliet as a play is not about love, it's a play about obedience. It's a play about what happens when a young girl disobeys her father and when a young boy disobeys his father. It's not a play about love, it's a play about obedience in an unsophisticated, patriarchal and pre-scientific world. And the suggestion, as you make, that we should spend a lot of our energy learning about love in that society, unsophisticated, patriarchal and pre-scientific, is inherently nostalgic. And what's more, it's nostalgic for a world that we are all glad no longer exists. So why spend time examining behaviors and relationships in such a world for our children to learn some kind of idea of the values they should be leading their lives by? As I predicted, you use the term universal. Okay, this is what Shakespeare critics do all the time. Shakespeare is universal, tells us what it's about to be human. So, it's universal. He tells us about love, power, ambition, blah, and blah, and blah, and blah, and blah. But you know as well as I do that when the term universal is used, what it really means, what it turns out it means, is that what we're discussing are values and events that happen to align with those values of the dominant class. So when we look at Shakespeare and we consider the universal idea of politics and power, what do we see? We see kings and aristocracy winning, and we see poor people and the commoners losing. Is that what? What?
30 seconds.
No way! I haven't even started. Objection, Your Honour. I think you've misread the time.
No.
Okay, is that what we want our children to learn? Our moral over-reliance on his plays is unimaginative to say the least, not least because by studying this stuff in school, we are actually turning a generation off Shakespeare. They do not know what they are studying or why they are studying because we don't know why we are teaching it. It's uncritical, unreflective habit. It's the very epitome of inertia and stagnation. At the close of a Shakespeare comedy, the female characters are married off to any man who will take them. In the other sorts of plays, they just die. Is this what we want our children to learn? Stay with me. This is specific historical literature that tells us a lot about a particular moment in time in a particular place. It doesn't tell us about now. At school, we should be opening the minds of our children to the possibilities and responsibilities of the future. We should not draw them back to the values and practices of an uncivilized, unsophisticated, and pre-scientific society while drumming into them these values and these practices as being universal and for all time. They are outmoded, thank goodness, and they are unworthy of us moderns who value equality, fairness, and compassion. I'm paying you, remember, so leave it. And finally, there is, of course, the language. It, too, is, on the whole, outmoded and opaque and works as a punishment for our children. The continued study of it at school is a demonstration of one of those universals in action. The insistence on the study of Shakespeare at school is the manifestation of the values of the ruling elite and the dominant class. An egalitarian society would throw off these shackles and cast them aside. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I appeal to your civilized values, to your modern sensibility, and to the love of your children. Shakespeare is not relevant. You surely must agree.
Thank you.
5 minutes, okay?
Obviously, there are many things that I totally, and indeed my client, totally accept about Bill's critique. Okay? This discussion is not about whether or not Shakespeare should be taught at school. This discussion is about whether or not Shakespeare is relevant. I totally agree that they teach Shakespeare too young. I totally agree that in many ways the way it's taught is very problematic. But in some ways, to think about Shakespeare, we have to, and to respond to many of Bill's arguments, we have to think about some of these ideas and issues that Bill has critiqued. And he's right to question the issue of universality. He's right to question values. He's right to question where these ideas come from. He's absolutely right to say we don't know why we teach Shakespeare anymore. That's true. We don't know why we teach Shakespeare anymore. And we don't know why we teach Shakespeare anymore because we're living in a very strange time. We're living in a strange time, only in Europe, not in the rest of the world, but in Europe in particular, in this country, in which we have lost all sight of a notion of aesthetics, lost all sight of a notion of how we would understand what it means for something to be great literature, what it means for something to be great art. It's a bizarre thing. It's a unique thing. When we say what is great art, we have no way of judging it anymore. It's about how much money something will get. When we want to say what is the greatest book of the 20th century, what do? We have a vote. That's banal. The most popular book of the 20th century is Lord of the Rings. If you look up on the Waterstones website, what is the greatest book of the 20th century, it will say Lord of the Rings. Winnie the Pooh is number 10. But we're in a strange moment where we don't have a proper aesthetic. We think we do. People talk about great literature. They talk about beautiful art. But we've kind of lost that. That's a really serious situation to be in. St. Augustine, in his text on the Trinity, I'm sure you've read it, Bill.
Objection, Your Honour. That was some kind of horrible thing to say.
Draws a distinction between wisdom and knowledge. Okay? For him, wisdom is eternal. Knowledge is of now. We need to think about that, because it's the same with the difference between truth and facts. Everything that Bill has said is factually true, but truths and facts are not the same thing. What Shakespeare is talking about, what constantly comes in his plays, and the difference between great literature and good literature is the way it talks about truths. Now, I accept totally that there are lots of other people, lots of other great writers. I didn't understand the truth about slavery until I read Tony Robinson, particularly Jazz. You know, a stunning author. She expanded my sense of the world. She expanded my sense of who I was. That's what great literature does. I'm quite happy to talk about great literature. I'm quite happy to talk about beauty. And I would ask my friend join me on that journey. Thank you.
Now opening to members of the jury. If anyone has any questions for both counsel or any witness statements or any additional information that may be of relevance to the court, there are people with microphones that are willing.
Just a moment, if you just wait for the microphone.
Okay. At what age do children learn it? I mean, what age are you speaking about? Just at university or at high school or middle school or whatever?
So they're all, if I may, they're already learning it often at primary school.
So like
8, 9, 10.
But books or say plays like Romeo and Juliet or sonnets or snippets or...
It will be snippets, but Romeo and Juliet is a very popular one. Mm-hmm. But of course they don't talk about it. If you know what I mean.
So the kids like it?
Well, in my experience, it depends. It depends, okay? I would say at state schools, many kids struggle with it. Possibly at more middle-class schools, they might like it. Tom would know.
I think there's a real issue with teaching Shakespeare too early, because I think that an awful lot of the jokes are bawdy, a lot of the jokes are sexually explicit, and if you teach it very early, because you don't want to teach that stuff and the kids won't understand it, you end up with a very kind of saccharine, weak version of Shakespeare. So I do think, but I don't think that's relevant. That's not relevant to the question of, is Shakespeare relevant now? That's a technical question about when we might want to teach Shakespeare to our children.
But I would still say Shakespeare is not relevant to now. If you, the values are the same. The values of this unsophisticated, patriarchal, pre-scientific world, irrespective of what age you are. So to value the ways in which they talk about love, politics, power, ambition, whatever, is in some way to value the values of that kind of world. A world which, as I say, we're all glad has gone.
Yeah, but
because
I will let you just, but I just need to answer that very quickly. Okay? Anyone who thinks we live in a scientific, rational, sane world is mad. Okay? We don't. All right? So, that's what I would say. Anyway.
We absolutely live in a scientific world. We absolutely do. It's scientific values trump all other values in Western Europe. That's not to say there are people challenging those values, but it absolutely is the dominant ideology and the dominant way in which our societies in Europe and America operate. Absolutely.
Hi, hello. Just to say, I come from a state school in Doncaster, and, which is very working class for people that don't know that. And a lot of my peers, when I was there, loved Shakespeare as much as I did. So I think to say that in state schools people struggle with it, I think would be an unfair comment. And I would like to say that as well, I think to say that these plays were written in a different values system, it doesn't really take into consideration how modern interpretations and modern directors and modern dramaturgs use the plays and provide that as a criticism upon culture as it is now. So it's not so much whether Shakespeare is relevant, it's how can the work still be made to be relevant, which I think, even though you, no offence, quite glibly said, putting Trump in a hat and and representing him there, that is still a commentary, and that is still making Shakespeare relevant. Shakespeare himself isn't relevant, but the way we use Shakespeare is relevant.
Well, just to be clear, I don't think it's fair to accuse Bill of being glib.
No, I'm sorry. I was trying to.
Hey, I can defend myself. You get back in your box. Just remember, I employed you. So, in terms of the relevance of how directors use Shakespeare and so on and so forth, my point is, yes, they can modernise it, but only in the most universal way. Again, I would ask you, even with Julius Caesar, okay, if you take a play like Julius Caesar, and there's a modern version on now that is all modern dress and everything, what does it tell us about our lives now? Something very general, okay? Power corrupts, okay? Is that it? Is that what makes it relevant? Because it says something, as, if I may say, as unsubtle as that? Power corrupts? I mean, that's a cliche. That's not a lesson to learn. That's a cliche.
But I don't think we as a society have learnt those cliches. We haven't realised yet that absolute power corrupts, absolutely. We haven't realised these universal issues yet, because we still suffer from the same universal issues that happened in Shakespeare's time. Religious repression, for example, in the theatre. In religious repression, for example, happens in our modern culture. They're the same universal truths, but they're just expressed in different ways.
So, exactly. So why not study modern literature that's talking about that?
Can I just
Why
respond?
go back 400 years to learn something about now?
Can I just respond? I would
No.
say one thing. Thank you very much for that very perspicacious intervention.
What?
What I would say about Julius Caesar is there is something interesting going on in a play which was banned both by the Shah of Iran and the Ayatollah Khomeini. Both groups thought there was something about Julius Caesar which was incompatible with their forms of government. There's something interesting going on there. And what that shows is that you're absolutely right. There is still something contemporary about Shakespeare.
No. Okay. Those societies that you have just described are precisely the sorts of societies like our society 400 years ago. That's why they don't want it.
Ooh, that's a terrible thing to say.
Patriarchal, undemocratic. Yeah, that's not I don't know what it's not, but anyway, okay, that's a different sort of society to our society, okay, and it's a society that I believe we don't wish to return to. That's not to say it's better or worse; it's different, but it's not our society.
So all I would say
anyway,
about
we better
that,
move on to another.
yeah. Well, all I would say about that is because I have a global perspective as opposed to a very English-centric one from my colleague. I would see those societies as part of my world. But anyway. Brian, we have another question.
Yeah, I think we should get another. Can we get the woman in red?
I think one of the arguments was to suggest that if we take the time to analyse and unpick the language in Shakespeare, that will give additional tools to help unpick and analyse some of the ways some of our politicians, including Mr. Trump, are speaking and behaving nowadays. And that will give us additional tools to perceive where the wool's being pulled over our eyes or where we're being led down blind alleys. However, we've all been studying Shakespeare at school for however long now. It doesn't seem to have worked.
Yet. That would be my argument. It hasn't worked yet. I'm optimistic it will work sometime in the future, and we will have Jerusalem.
Well, I mean, I think
now.
that's very apt. Why not study Jerusalem? Jez Butterworth's Jerusalem. Okay, a play from 2 years ago that will tell you absolutely, clearly, the nature of English society now. The power relations within English society now. Why go back to Julius Caesar and try and work it out from there? I can't understand what the driver is there. It's a habit. We're locked into that habit. Anyway, there's loads more questions.
Yeah, so the gentleman with his hand.
Come on, judges, be decisive. The gentleman with his hand up, yes. You mean the gentleman with the hair?
So, Bill, thank you very much. I mean, that was very persuasive. But I think you have to ask yourself a question. You have to ask yourself a question. The language that we have now, the English language, how many words do you think Shakespeare, I mean, you know what it is. How many words did Shakespeare, no, but answer the question.
Right.
How many words did Shakespeare, just answer the question, Bill.
How many words did Shakespeare invent?
Invent.
0.
Right. 1,700.
No, he didn't.
You can document it. Second question, Bill.
No, hang on,
Second,
stop.
Let me finish.
That has not been documented.
I'd like to ask
It's a myth.
Can I finish my comments?
Yeah.
Right. So 1,700 words Shakespeare invented, and they're all documented, well received. The other question I have, Bill, you keep saying that it's English. Shakespeare is universal. You go to the Far East, you go to the South Pacific, you go all over the world. It is articulating and expressing the sentiments of what it means, and I know you don't want to use this, what it means to be human, what dignity means to some extent. It gives you the complexity of appreciating the actual multiple layers of what love means. I mean, the love from Romeo and Juliet, the innocence of love, and then the love of Lear, of the fatherly figure coming to terms with his own end and seeing the most precious thing that he's loved and that is ignored actually is the most important thing. And love also as a transactional deal, as Tom said, love is portrayed in its manifold way. But I haven't finished yet, so I'm going to make a few more points, and then I'll allow you to intervene. So given all of this, Bill, to some extent, you've got to ask yourself also the question, how do we appreciate the cliches? I mean, everything is a cliche in life. And the question is, how can we appreciate those cliches? And we have to go into a language or a frame of reference that alienates us from our present society such that we can critique those cliches. And it's a very dangerous road, Bill, you're going on. And you have to be very careful. I haven't finished yet, because what tends to happen, Bill, is that if we followed what you said, we are heading, and I agree with Tom, down a popularist route where small phrases, small hidden simplifications of what statements should mean are held as truths.
Okay.
And I think all of this is very...
I think I should respond.
You think we should shut up now, yes. Thank you. And we did it for you, Akram, because I got the feeling you might spontaneously combust if you go on. Now, okay, a few responses. First of all, the idea that Shakespeare invented words in the 1700s and they're documented is a myth. It's a lie, as is, same sort of thing, okay? Shakespeare Birthplace Trust, 5 houses in Stratford, all related to Shakespeare. They take your money, they take you in. None of those houses are related to Shakespeare in any form, okay? Now, most people in the world would say that's a truth, that those houses belong to him. Same with the language. It's nonsense. Second thing about, I don't know what it was about. Okay, about...
Can I just correct something?
No, hang on. This is universal stuff, okay? Universal. Which countries play rugby and cricket? Those countries which were colonized by us, okay? Which countries, if you trace it back, valued Shakespeare first? Those countries which were colonized by us. The universality of Shakespeare is a colonial. It's a colonial event, okay? And it's not suddenly these societies thought, Shakespeare, yeah, blimey, he's better than anything we've got, and he tells us about our society. As in the same way that the Bible was pushed on these people, so was Shakespeare, okay, particularly Hamlet, if I may say. And the last thing, okay, about this populist route, this truth, blah, 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 all very, articulate and eloquent, but quite meaningless, in the sense that if, and I think it relates to Tom's argument that we've lost all idea of aesthetics, okay? Now we don't know what great art is rubbish. What we've lost and what we've changed is we don't have a small ruling elite that tells us what great art is and what great books are. We have a democracy of people saying, no, this is what is great to me. And that is beautiful. That's a beautiful development.
But you gave it away to some extent.
You've talked enough now.
Can I just say, I need to say a couple of points. I'd like to apologise to any French people in the room, because, of course, France plays rugby and has never been colonialised by the UK, despite your implication. I'd also like to say...
if you trace it back in history and then the development.
I'd also like to say that the fact that there are these houses which aren't related to Shakespeare, that's a fact. It's not a truth. They're different. And what we're talking about when we're talking about Shakespeare is truths. Okay? And, I am articulating there a particular position, a kind of Platonic position, but it is what I believe. Okay? And it is something we need to hold on to. There is a difference between facts and truths.
But what are you saying about truth? That Shakespeare expresses truth?
When he talks about... Yeah, I do. I do think
but that's a truism.
Yeah, it may well be.
In unexamined blur.
Yeah.
Okay.
Truths are unexamined. Love has to be something which is absolute. Has to be. Otherwise, it's not love. It's not a truth.
We'll get another question. Can we get the lady at the back?
There's the chap over there. He's had his hand up.
I think
very
there's
well, with the grey hairs.
truth between what you say, as so
Speaking
often.
to the...
There's truth between what you say, as so often, except that Professor Leahy has got a bit muddled about history, because Julius Caesar wasn't 400 years ago. Sorry, it was a bit longer than that. And I think what you have to realise is that when I don't know what you were talking about. Anyway, it was longer than 400 years ago. But the point is that I think what you've both said makes me very much aware that Shakespeare does need to be played and talked about in its own political context. I mean, of course things were different then, like people got married at 13 and things like that. They did. So you can really only understand it if you put it in the historical context. And then it's up to intelligent people to suddenly see the parallels between Romeo and Juliet and Julius Caesar and all the other things. You can then bring it out and see there are parallels between Henry V and the Iraq War. You don't have to put tanks and suddenly pretend it's in modern dress. And I think this is where we go wrong, is taking it out of its proper historical context of when the plays were written about.
Okay, thank you. I mean, I disagree.
Thank you very much.
And one thing I disagree with you there is, well, not disagree, why bother, I'm saying, okay? Because there is literature about the Iraq War. Read that. Why not read that? Why work through, particularly, again, with our children, trying to make them work through how we can make this mean this? We don't need to do that. We don't need to do it. It's not only, no, it's great literature has been written about it.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, so I'm from the education department here at Brunel, and so when Shakespeare's taught. So yes, okay, ideas, characters from Shakespeare introduced in primary school, but really it's commonly Shakespeare talked about year 8, talking about 12 or 13-year-olds. So one thing I would say to Professor Betteridge is, you know, there might be reasons for not doing it that early, but I'm afraid it's not because they don't get the dirty jokes. Because 12 and 13-year-olds
totally
understand all of that. That's one thing. I'm going to pitch in, because I'm going to go after you in a minute, Professor Leahy, but I'm going to pitch in just on the how many words Shakespeare invented. Of course, even if the Shakespearean corpus is the first attestation we have of a lot of these words, it doesn't mean that Shakespeare invented them. He could have heard them down the pub, they could be recorded elsewhere, and they didn't last. And I want to say something about that lastingness, because it occurs to me, Professor Lee, you're saying we have here lots of bad examples, and we shouldn't read the bad examples, bad moral messages. But that seems to me to be not the most worked through understanding of how literature teaches. I mean, classical literature, contemporary literature never tells an unambiguous moral message. We don't simply read off a moral message from the play. There's a dialogic engagement. And it seems to me the reason why we keep going, because of course if there wasn't still this possibility of that interaction, we wouldn't stage the plays anymore, and probably over time we'd realise that we shouldn't teach them in school anymore. But the point is that these plays are important because of that ambiguity, because they pose a challenge to the audience, precisely because they don't unambiguously tell a bad moral story or a good moral story. I think they provoke and require a response from their audience.
Quite, but so there's lots of other stuff. That's my point. So there's lots of other stuff, and Shakespeare, our focus on Shakespeare is choking so much else. Not only contemporary literature, it chokes literature from its own time. We work so hard to make Shakespeare relevant. We could do the same work, but we don't, with Marlowe, with Middleton, with all sorts of others. We could do the same with Ibsen. We could do the same with lots and lots of things. But we focus so much energy and so much of our cultural space on Shakespeare. It chokes so much else. Why don't we just put it to one side and look at what else is there? Now, this is not only Shakespeare. In many countries, they have some kind of national poet who tends to dominate and choke a lot of particularly new culture coming through. and particularly in the theatre, okay, because we have a limited number of theatres, okay. It's very, very difficult very often to put on new plays, but you look in whatever you read, Shakespeare's been put on all over the place all the time. It's choking our culture.
I would just say that because there's an argument that it is our culture, and that one of the reasons we put on Shakespeare in comparison to some of those other people is Shakespeare's much, 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 much better than Marlowe. That's all I would say.
I would say some Shakespeare is better than some Marlowe, but some Shakespeare is terrible.
Yeah, okay.
It's terrible.
But that is a value judgment.
You've got to remember, I don't think Shakespeare wrote the play, but anyway, yeah.
I think we should take 2 last questions. Just get
This
one
young
down
girl,
front.
Hello, hi. I'm Iman from the University of Warwick.
You're looking at me. You're giving me that.
I'm looking at you. Yes, I'm Shakespearean. I'm a great fan, and Professor Betteridge has just brought me to Brunel. So I hope he's not.
Oh, yeah.
I hope he's not going to be disappointed in my intelligence.
Well, so you've just employed her like I employed you.
Yeah.
Oh, right, okay.
But I'm not as intelligent. Okay. Right, so that's a great point. I mean, yes, I do agree that Shakespeare tends to dominate early modern literature, and that's part of sort of my passion for everything Shakespeare, but also other than Shakespeare. It's important. The reason why I think that Shakespeare continues to be relevant, and the reason why I think that our students in schools have the right to know these plays and to experience them is because they have the right to know where our modern values come from. I mean, if they don't see Shylock on stage saying, "Hath not a Jew eyes?" how are they going to experience that idea that we need tolerance, we need religious tolerance? How can you sort of convince them of modern values when they don't know where they come from?
Okay,
it's that history, it's that background which is needed.
Exactly.
And another point, sorry, it's a long comment. Another point is I do think that the reading of the plays you sort of offered, of the selected plays, was a little bit problematic. Because when you say that the Taming of the Shrew offers us at the very end, the last scene, a woman who's subjected and humiliated, that absolutely misreads the play because it's part of a frame. It's there as a fantasy, and the fantasy is of a working class drunk who was convinced that he is somebody who is an elite person, and this is the fantasy that is put up for him. So that's one thing. The other thing is about anti-Semitism. Shylock is not presented entirely as a devil, like other Jews were presented in the period. He is given a point of view, and it's a strong point of view. You would be very hard-hearted not to sympathize with him, not to cry for him. I saw it at the RSC recently. It was horrible, the final scene where he is made to convert. It's horrible.
Okay, so yep.
They're relevant. That's
right,
my
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So let me come back at you with those 2 examples. Because what I think you're doing is, and you know, I understand why you're doing it, it's a very common trait, and that is what criticism often does is try and rescue Shakespeare. You're trying to rescue Shakespeare from accusations of negative values. As I say, The Merchant of Venice is a comedy. It's a comedy. Okay, so remember, it's a comedy. So this baiting humiliation of this... Well, again, okay, it's complex, but it's not that complex. He's humiliated. Hang on. Look, the microphone's gone, so let me speak. Okay, let me finish. No, you're not going to get fired. Tom, we need to have a word. Okay, so The Merchant of Venice, okay, is problematic, and as you say, it's so sad at the end. Yes, it is. Stop talking, it's my job. Microphone, standing up. Okay, but it's not a tragedy. It's not. It absolutely matters what it is called, and the reason. Okay, no, let me finish, please. The reason it is so often played now as a tragedy is because we cannot stomach the idea it's a comedy, hang on, and it's a comedy written by our great hero Shakespeare. First example. Second example, Taming of the Shrew. You are trying to rescue Shakespeare with this. I've seen it so often. Well, yeah, I mean, he was deliberately putting it as this because it's a critique of patriarchy. I'm sorry, but if you look at Shakespeare's corpus, to say that the corpus is in some way a defense of femininity and in some way an accusation of patriarchy, I can't see that reading at all, not least because, as I say, women at the end of plays do two things. They get married or they are killed.
No, sorry, I have an objection.
No, you have to wait. No, stop. Let someone else ask a question.
We'll
go one more.
One more?
One
Yeah.
more. Run out front.
Maybe two more. That lady afterwards.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh.
Hello, is it on?
Yeah, just speak into it.
Is that okay? Right, I'm an older person. I learned Shakespeare. We started learning Shakespeare when we went to school at for our O-levels as they were then. So we were 15 and 16, which I think is probably correct. But if you're saying that we shouldn't learn Shakespeare now or do Shakespeare now, you might as well say, well, we might as well not learn about history at all, because what happened 500 years ago is not relevant now. So in other words, we might as well forget all the past history because it's not relevant now, and we should only learn what's happening now.
Okay, so
I don't see that argument can be.
Right.
Also, surely there's a case for learning all literature. Just to do Shakespeare and to read Shakespeare, it's a pleasure. The language is beautiful, you learn new words, you learn new phrases, whether or not you understand them or not. And there's also a case, obviously, for doing modern literature, which is taught now. There's plenty of theatres doing Ibsen, all the old classics, and all the modern plays, which are usually rubbish, and musicals,
I think you've just
and
revealed
everything
something
again. So, no, I'm saying modern plays, not I'm saying modern, I don't mean modern plays. I mean, some of the things aren't very good. And all the classics are always being done all the time anyway.
okay,
besides
fair enough.
Shakespeare
But some of Shakespeare's not very good either. But
No,
but
it's
my
not-
point
it's not
is,
very good.
no, we do history in history. Okay, what I'm saying, we approach Shakespeare in the way that we approach all other literature. And that's to say, for example, you come to university to study literature and you study a module on Shakespeare in its historical context. You don't study modules about how Shakespeare is full of universal values that are relevant to us today, because they're not.
Oh, well, I don't know.
So
in my view.
I would like to just say something about that. There's a brilliant poem by Bertolt Brecht called Questions from a Worker Who Reads. And I'd strongly recommend it, because it's a poem which is a critique of history. It's asking the questions which are never asked. Okay? And that's because what he's doing there, Brecht, is opening up, because he's a Marxist, ideas about what history is. History isn't the past. That's the past. History is the story we tell about the past. And when we engage with someone like Shakespeare, what we actually engage with is the relationship between the past and the present. That's what he constantly teaches us, that negotiation. And the key thing is, that's what we're doing in ourselves. That's what selfhood is. Sorry, this is going to sound very parodic, but I'm going to quote St. Augustine again. St. Augustine's Confessions is the first ever autobiography written. And it's an autobiography which is all about the tension between the past, memory, the future, and the present in relation to who we are, our sense of self. So when we study Shakespeare, what we study is someone, to take David's point, which is who allows us to understand the negotiation between the present, the past, and the future, which is dynamic. It's always dynamic. That's what it is.
Yeah, we have, I think, time for one more question.
One more question,
very quick
good.
one.
Yeah, one more? One more? No, just one
more.
more.
Down. There's one at the top, actually. Can we ask our Professor of Law her question, please, which is up the top there?
There was a question here.
Well, we'll have two more questions then.
Very quick, two very quick ones.
Yeah, you need to have Alex's question, because
All right, okay,
she's marking your final
essays. That has to be the last one. Okay, this one and then that one. Yeah, go on, Tej.
Bill isn't...
Speak into the mic, yeah?
Bill isn't saying that it shouldn't be taught. He's saying that space should be made for other things to be taught as well. And what you were saying earlier about our culture being globalized, and you see those parts of the world as, so why is Shakespeare considered to be the central constituent of our modern culture? Why do we not study ancient Indian plays or African plays from ancient times? And there needs to be, so Shakespeare has its place, but there needs to be space made for for other things to be taught as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I would say that my client, given his tendency to steal everything from everyone else, would totally agree with you.
Thank you.
Alex at the top.
Final question.
Yes, not very dissimilar question. Do you think that maybe the English have this obsession with Shakespeare, at least for some of us Europeans, this is what it looks like? Because maybe it reminds them of the time where England was a very big commercial power. And here I want to disagree about the history, because there's no history, there are histories. And I wonder whether Shakespeare tells a history, but by emphasizing and focusing so much on that history, we don't allow space and time and reflection on the other histories that already are not dominant. So by continuing the dominant story, we put aside and we neglect the other stories that also have to be heard and discussed.
I think that one's for you, Tom.
I think that's true. Okay, that's a very perspicacious question. I think that there are two answers to it. One of them, of course, is that you're right, okay, but we have to accept that Shakespeare, for whatever reasons, has a dominant place, and therefore, in order to open up those histories, one way of doing that is to talk about the histories as they exist within Shakespeare. You know, we have a strange idea about what is the historical moment of Shakespeare. Okay, so for example, someone said earlier, well, of course, people got married when they were 13 in Elizabethan England. No, they didn't. The marriage age in Elizabethan England was the same as it is now. It's about 24, 25. You can't get married in Elizabethan England until you've finished your apprenticeship. Okay, so some of the myths we tell about history, Shakespeare happens. You know, certainly the Fairy Queen could have been what we used. There could have been all sorts of other things could have been used. But the reality is, it is now part of our culture. Equally, if we think about Shakespeare, actually the time in which he wrote, England was a mediocre European power, unimportant. Shakespeare's theatre, you know, where is it taking place? It takes place in Southwark. Why in Southwark? Because no one knows who's in control of Southwark. It's not in London. It's south of the river. Shakespeare's theatre takes place where the brothels are, where the inns are, where the bear-baiting bits are. When we start thinking about Shakespeare, actually, it explodes some of our myths about high culture, about elite culture. Shakespeare was writing for his audience, and he was writing as an entertainer. And as soon as he made enough money, he stopped writing and went back to Stratford and became a landed gentry. He didn't think of himself as a great artist. He thought of himself as a businessman and an entertainer. So then we can use, now I accept that it's just luck in some ways. It just happens to be that Shakespeare has become this thing, but he has become this thing. And therefore, in terms of opening up these histories, thinking about what I said about Brecht's poem, Shakespeare is actually the perfect vehicle for it.
Or stop doing it. So this idea that Shakespeare is this dominant thing and he just is and that's the way it is precisely what those who want to diversify the canon are fighting against. Yes, old white men have always dominated the canon. Is that so? That's it? We just have to stick with it? Of course not. And not only that, it's not difficult to change. You just change your mind. You just say, actually, for 10 years, let's not do that. Let's do this. See where we go with that. There you go.
I think that's all the time we have for questions. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you've heard the evidence and it's now your time to give your verdict. If you believe Shakespeare is still relevant, please hold up your yay cards, the yellow side. If you believe Shakespeare is not relevant, please hold up your nay cards.
Isn't that strange? Most of the people on this side, near me, say nay, and most over there say, well, we're going to have to, we need a count. So I'll tell you what we do. So just the I's, the A or the I, hold up your cards. Just not the nays. Put it down. Right, can somebody, Karina, or can you count them? Let the judge do it, Tom, because you'll be biased. Toby? Bloody hell.
I'd like to point out that what's happening here is my esteemed colleague is trying to bully the jury. That is what is happening here.
Yeah, we've got the number. Can we see the nays?
I thought we were mates.
Well, I think we have a majority verdict, so I believe that the A side did win, so Shakespeare is relevant. It's
33-25.
Toby. Hang on, we haven't finished yet, sir.
Merchant of Venice is a love story where a woman teaches a man what love is about. Shylock is the stumper.
Okay, have you ever...
Well, no, we're not opening it up. We're not opening it up.
Okay, read the title page. It's the comedy.
Yeah, no, we're not. No.
Well, there you are then.
Yeah, you are.
All right, hang on. Whoa.
Stop.
Yeah.
We need to pass sentence.
Look, this is becoming a bit 12 Angry Men, so let's just stop now. Tom, let the judges get a pass sentence.
I think we need to bring it to a close. It's a bit late. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Technically means there's a happy ending. It doesn't mean it's all fun. It doesn't mean it's all joke. It doesn't mean the ending is happy. Sorry, Bill.
Yes, but in order for us to have a happy ending, I think we all agree that we want to see the sentence passed on Bill.
Yeah.
Hang on.
I think that will definitely make this a happy...
So let them pass sentence. I would disagree that there's a happy ending for Shylock in The Merchant of Venice.
So, Mr. Leahy,
Yep.
as we've heard, we've got a majority verdict. That means you are bound to be sentenced. So your sentence is you have to read a passage of Shakespeare. And Constable, please take Mr. Leahy away.
Well, I haven't got a constable yet.
You haven't got a constable.
Ted, you're the constable, right? But yeah, you have to lead
Yeah,
me
you
out. But I have to read a bit of Shakespeare. Okay. Okay,
I just say, has to read a bit of Shakespeare seriously.
Yeah. Okay. And don't get me wrong, lots of Shakespeare is beautiful. Love it. Our revels are now ended. These, our actors, as I foretold you, were all spirits and are melted into air. Hey, I'm better than you lot. Into thin air. And, like the baseless fabric of this vision, the cloud-capped towers, the gorgeous palaces, the solemn temples, the great globe itself, yea, all which it inherit, shall dissolve, and, like this insubstantial pageant, faded, leave not a rack behind. We are such stuff as dreams are made on, and our little life is rounded with a sleep. Leave me out now, go on. All right, great, cheers. It's all right, I forgot. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I'm not really going to prison.
Well, Well, let's be clear, not going to prison yet.
Yeah. No, again, actually. So, thank you ever so much for coming along. Now, before I kind of round off the week and everything, let me just say one thing about tonight. And, sorry to have my back towards you. The important thing about tonight, and something that is very close to my heart as a teacher and as someone interested in Shakespeare, is that Shakespeare and all cultural artifacts and cultural experiences must always continue to be challenged all the time, or else they become stagnant, they become dead, they become kind of worthless, they become, no, I was going to swear there, I won't say that, they become uninteresting, and I do think that's one of the problems our children at school have with Shakespeare. It's become that thing for them, and we need to examine it, pick it apart, and argue about it. As much as we do about whether he wrote the plays or not, we need to argue about these things, because that's what will keep it fresh. That's what will keep it meaningful, and that's where new meanings will come from it. On this evening and the rest of the week, so this is the 4th event, our Shakespeare week is coming to an end. If you've been to a number of the events, thank you so much. If you've been just to 2, thank you. If this is your only one, thank you for coming. I hope you've enjoyed this evening. The rest of the events, outside now is wine, women and song. No, it's wine, peanuts and stuff like that, okay? It's free. And are you all, yeah, you're over 18. So, there's no 13-year-olds though, is there? So please stay. The conversation will continue. You can come up to me, you can abuse me, you can hit me. Please, I like it, okay? But do stay. Thank you so much, and thank you to all of our actors. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot.